Hello, my name is Bryant Nelson. I'm a business intelligence representative for Ben Stocks on the account management team here at New Dawn. For today's webinar, I will be covering some of JDA's more advanced features and functions. This webinar is intended for those with a basic understanding of JDA who are looking to further build on that understanding. The advanced JDA webinar will be broken down into two parts. This broadcast will be the first of those two. We'll be focusing on the JDA side of things today, and the second part will be focusing on creating and manipulating data sources. If you have any questions or concerns during the broadcast, we will have a few people monitoring the Join Me chat window to answer those questions. I appreciate you all taking the time to view this webinar. We will get started with if statements. The if clauses that I'm going to talk about today are ands, ors, record count, and loop index. Let's start with an AND clause. So when I say AND clause, I'm referring to putting two different criteria in one if and only having the if fire if they're both true. For this example, let's do representation on a defendant. So I want to check for if the defense attorney is there or not, and if the defendant's age is greater than 18. And if so, I want it to type pro se. So to do that, I'm going to insert a fill point from my defense attorney, and I'm going to say dot is empty. Now to do the and portion of this, I'm going to type in 2 ampersands right after that. There doesn't need to be a space or anything, it just, right after your first criteria is in, you put in 2 ampersands. Now after my ampersands, I'm going to put in my second set of criteria. In this case, I want to check my defendant's age and say, is it greater than 18? We could even say greater than or equal to 18. If both of these things are true, I want to type pro se. And if either of those things aren't true, I want to type my defense attorney's full name. So that right there is an AND clause and an if statement. You go about an if until you get your first criteria in, 2 ampersands, and then you can insert a second set of criteria. Now this will only fire if those two things are true. So let's talk about an OR clause now. So for an OR clause, it works pretty much the exact same way, except it allows the if to fire if only one of the two things are true. So for this example, let's do case type description. So if my case type description equals criminal felony, or, so to do an or, I'm going to type 2 vertical bars, just like that. On your keyboard, the vertical bars are usually located right above the enter. Mine shares a key with the backslash, so you hold shift and you push backslash, and that gives you the 2 vertical bars. And that's the OR clause in JDA. So if case type description equals criminal felony, or let's do the exact same fill point and say equal to criminal misdemeanor, then I want this to be district court, else juvenile. Just like that. So if and clauses and or clauses are the exact same. Ands use the double ampersand and ors do the double bars. So let's talk about record counts now. So I'm going to type the word count in here because this is a real common use of this. Basically what record count does is it counts the number of records that are coming back from your JustWare database. So if you're doing if statements against JW underscore count, and you have 3 counts in JustWhere, that number is going to be 3 that comes back. So what that allows us to do in this instance is change the, or in this case, add an S on the end of count if there's more than one is what I'm going to do. So to do a record count, all you need in your if statement is your data source name. So none of the fields inside this data source, but rather just the data source name. In this case, it's JW underscore count. And then you either type in dot record count, or if you'd rather insert it instead of type it, you can find it under properties and under table. And then on the end, in this case, I'm going to say greater than 1. So if I have more than one count on my case, I want an S just right there. And that's it. That way, in my document, instead of having like parenthesis S parenthesis, it will just always read count or counts appropriately. So that's what record count does. The final if clause I'm going to show is .loop index. And in order to show you this, I have to get a multi-select in here. And we're going to do it against count. So, say you have a multi-select against all your counts on your case, and you want the count numbers to come in. So we go preview, it shows us our 3 counts, but for whatever reason, let's drop count 2 off of this. Next, finish. Now my document's going to read count 1, count 3. And that, for some people that might be okay. For others, they might want it to read count 1, count 2, regardless of whether they actually selected count 2 or not. So what loop index does is it assigns a number to each row that's coming back from JustWhere. And the reason I picked multi-select to show this is because multi-select lets you eliminate some of those rows by choice. You can choose to uncheck some of the rows and therefore, well, with my count example, have a count 1, space, count 3, count 5. You can have an inconsistency in your count numbers. So in order to do a loop index, you can pick any field inside your table. It doesn't matter. I can do case ID, count ID. It doesn't matter which one of these I do. And then you just put .loop index on the end. So now when I preview this and I drop my count 2 off of there, it reads count 1, count 2. Because instead of actually using the field that I selected, it simply just brought back a number 1 for the first row, a number 2 for the second row. If you don't want to type loop index, you can also find that under for each loop, under properties. That's loop index. The next thing I'm going to cover is dialogues. So when you hear the term dialogue in JDA, it's always going to be referring to the pop-ups that you get whenever you're previewing out of the JDA editor or generating out of the filing cabinet. Common examples you'll see is addresses. Pick the address for this person that you would like, or pick the court event that you would like to go for this. So what I'm going to show you is how to create and manipulate those dialogues to do whatever it is that you would like them to do. So in order to do this, you'll go Edit, Data Source, and it'll be the third tab on your data source screen called Dialogues. So this is my dialog screen. You can see over on the right I have all my existing dialogues, and over on the left is the area where I create my new dialogues. So I'm just going to go over what each of these fields mean. Dialog name is what it will show up as over there on the right. So for this purpose, I always like to keep my dialogues, I like to keep the names of my dialogues consistent with what they are, what they're being used for. So say I have an information document, and inside there I want to do a dialog pop-up for, is this information amended? I would name this something like amended info, so that I would know later on, oh yeah, that's my amended information dialog. So amended info is going to be what shows up over here on the right. Title is going to be what shows up on the header of my pop-up box. So this is good to give context to whoever it is that's generating the document. So we're going to say amended information. And now I'm going to insert a new control. So there's a few different control types that you can do. You can do checkboxes, which allow you to give your end users multiple choices without limiting them down to just one. They could pick 2, 3, 4, just like you'd expect a checkbox function to do. You can do date time, which works exactly like the date drop down in Justware. You click the drop down, it gives you the little calendar and you can have the option of adding time on there if you'd like. Drop downs and radio buttons are both exactly like checkboxes, with the exception of their options are mutually exclusive. Meaning if you put 3 radio buttons in there, they can't pick more than one. They can only pick one. Numeric text box is just a text box that only allows numbers. I don't see this one get used a lot. The big use I think I've seen is for money, because you can allow decimals, and then you can put this inside a format currency, and then that can be a money field for restitution, whatever have you. And finally, text box. Text box is probably the most common one, about the easiest to use. It just gives your end user a free text field. They can type numbers, letters, spaces, tabs, hard returns, anything they'd like in this text box. And it's going to insert that everywhere in your document that you have this fill point. So those are all the different kinds of controls that we have. If you'll notice down below here, I've got 2 additional fields that I need to fill out, similar to up here. So fill point is referring to the second part of my JDA code that I'm going to see when I'm working in the JDA editor. So in this part, I'm going to type amended. And what this is going to read as is amended info, which is my name, dot amended, which is my fill point. Caption, and if you'll look over to the left, you already see the title for bound field 2 over there. Caption is what we use to give our end users more specific context. So in here I'm going to type, is the information amended? And I'm going to change this to a radio control. And I'm going to give 2 new label. And I'm going to say this one is 1 for yes, and this one is 2 for no. So I'm going to add that to data source. When you're creating a brand new one, it'll pop up and ask you to name it, which this is more or less just a check to make sure that you don't have 2 of the same name over here. If I type test in here, since I already have one over there on the right called test, it'll say name already exists. So we'll keep it at amended info. Okay. So when you're doing checkboxes, drop downs, radio buttons, one thing to note is the label values. So for my values, I gave that dialog 1 and 2, and then the labels to that is yes and no. The reason that I did 1 and 2 on my values is simply because when I'm writing if statements against this, I don't want to have to type yes, no. I just want to be able to type dot value equals 1, dot value equals 2. So when you're writing if statements against dialogues, remember that you can check either the value or the label. And to do that, you just at the end of your fill point you type dot value equals 1 or I could alternatively type .label equals yes. They both work the same. There's no reason that one is better than the other. I've seen dialogues created where instead of doing numbers or letters for their values, they'll simply just put yes, yes, no, no on the value and the label. And that's absolutely fine. Just something to note. So, I'm going to show now how you can use these dialogues dynamically. And when I say dynamically, I mean having one set of dialogue trigger another set of dialogue. So I'm going to insert one that I've already built called testimony needed. Let's give this a preview. And it's going to ask, is a testimony needed? And I'm going to say yes. Yes, all right. There it is. So now I want to take this a step further and say when testimony needed equals yes to actually give me a testimony checkbox, or pardon me, a text box. So to do that, I'm going to insert an if, insert my testimony needed.testimony, and I'm going to say if the value of that equals 1, because I always put 1 for yes and 2 for no, then insert my just plain text checkbox testimony, and if. So what this will do is it's not going to actually show me this text box unless that equals 1. So I'm going to click preview. I'm going to leave it on yes and click next. And now I have a new dialog. Please enter testimony here. Now next, finish. There's my text box. If I come back and click preview and I click down to no, that's it. There's no else on my if. It just doesn't bring it in. So that's what I mean when I'm referring to dynamic dialogue. And you can have 3 or 4, I've seen up to 5 different layers of this if triggers this if on dialogues. The final thing that I want to show about dialogues is our show dialogue function. This one's a little more rare. It's kind of on the complicated end of things, so bear with me. In order for show dialogues to function properly, you need either a for each or a multi-select block. For this example, I'm going to do a for each against JW Vic Wit off for all my victim witnesses and officers on this case. So, just like in the previous example, I want it to ask if testimony is needed. So I'm going to go .value equals 1 on my testimony needed dialog. Now from here, here's where it gets tricky. I want it to show my dialog for each one of my victim witnesses and officers. So in order to do the show dialog function, you go to functions, dialog, and it's the only option in there. So when I insert this fill point, it's going to give me a fill point with parentheses and 1 comma. So the correct syntax to go here is before the comma is the name of the dialogue that you're doing your show dialogue against. So before I do that, let me show you the dialogue that I've created. So I've created this text box called testimony, and in the dialogue title, I've put testimony for, and then I've done an @var. What this @var does is it takes whatever I specify in my show dialog and it inserts it there. In this example, I'm going to take the full name of my victim, witness, or officer and insert it there, so that as each one of these text box pops up for my end user, they'll say testimony for Ben Stocks, testimony for New Dawn Technology. That gives them context as to whose is whose. So when I say the name of the dialogue that you're doing your show dialogue against, I mean this here. You don't need the the fill point inside. You just need whatever the drill down on it is. So in this case, it's testimonies for Vic Whit. I'm going to insert that in there. Delete the testimony part off because that's the fill point. And after the comma is the field that is going to be replacing that @var in my title. So I'm going to open up JW Vic Whit off, grab my full name and insert it. And that's it. That's my show dialog. So now I'm just going to insert my testimony text box there. I'm going to end that if statement so that if they select no, they don't see any of this. And then I'm going to put a hard return and end my for each. So I'm going to give this a preview. So is a testimony needed? I'm going to say yes. And now I've got a new testimony checkbox with context for each one of my victims, witnesses, and officers on my case. And I can come through here and type in each one of these, and it'll be distinct for each victim, witness, officer. So again, this functionality is, you don't see it as much, but it is there, and it's pretty cool if you have a good use for it. So that's everything that I have to show for dialogues. I'm now going to talk about multi-selects and what I call the trickle-down effect. So when your JDA document is executing, when you're generating it out of the filing cabinet, it always runs from left to right, from down, top to bottom. What that means when you're doing for eaches and multi-selects in your document is that it's going to execute the first one that it runs into. And from there, it's going to remember that for the rest of the way down. So I'm going to insert a new multi-select. We'll go against count again. And I'm going to just end it without putting anything in it. So I'm going to preview this. There's my 3 counts. Everything looks good there. I didn't put anything in. So the reason I'm showing this is, what if you have 2 different places in your document where you're pulling count information, but you do want to multi-select? Well, you'd think you could come down, down a ways and do just another multi-select against count. But the problem is the trickle effect is going to take whatever the top one yields. In this case, I'm going to uncheck 2. And that bottom one is only going to be past those 2 because the top one's already filtered 2 out. And that's probably not what we want to see. So the way you work around this, and the way you get your multi-select to work on more than one spot in your document, is you always do your very first occurrence as a multi-select, and then every other occurrence you do after that needs to be a for each. Where this is on JW count, this for each will pick up the rows that come down from my multi-select. They will trickle down, if you will. So now that I've got a for each there, I'm going to click preview. Notice I don't have another one asking me again, finish. And the for each will obey the rows that my multi-select passed down. The final thing that I'm going to show with multi-select is select all, select none. So if you notice, when I click preview, all of my checkboxes are checked by default. They've added a select all, select none right here, which, is nice. You can just come in here, and if you only wanted count 1 and there was 10 counts, you could just unselect all and check 1. Some people don't like to do that, though. So there's a little known fact in here that you can change what the default is on your multi-select. You can have it either have them all checked by default, or you can have none of them checked by default. And the way you do that is after you've declared what table you're going against. In this case, I'm going against JW count. You put a comma and you type select none preview. Now none of them are checked by default. So this is good if you've got like subpoena documents that have 50 Vic offs on it and you need to sort through and figure out who's going where, and usually it's less than more. This is what you would use that for. What I'm going to talk about now are what they call complex CCAs and hard returns. If you'll remember back to the basic JDA webinar that you watched, you saw CCA and hard return in action with but a single fill point inside of them. Throw count number in there, you preview, it takes whatever you inserted in there and it does a comma, comma, and format. What I'm going to show you how to do is how to do more than just a single fill point. So, and when you insert a brand new CCA, it gives you a comma inside your parentheses. So a CCA kind of acts like a for each. It just does whatever, it does every single row that it's told to do. When you do just a single fill point, it automatically points itself at the table that the fill point's from. So when you're doing a complex CCA, you need to specify which table. And this is very similar to a for each, except it doesn't need a variable or the word in. So my table is JW underscore count, JW underscore count over here. That's all I need before my comma. Now after the comma is where you specify what string of things you want CCA'd. Now when you're doing a complex CCA, you have two different things that you can have looped over in the CCA. The first thing is a fill point. You can have 1, 2, 3, you can have as many fill points as you'd like, as long as they're from this table. Or they only return one row, like a case ID, that would be okay. So, for this example, I'm going to start this off with the second kind of thing that you can have, which is free text. So when you're doing free text, you have to enclose it with single quotes. So I'm going to do single quote, count, space, and then end it. Now when you're doing multiple objects, you have to split them with a plus sign. So now that I want to insert another object, I'm going to do a plus, and I'm going to do count number. Now when I preview this, count 1, comma, count 2, and count 3. So let's add another object now. I'm going to do another plus. Let's do single quote, space, single quote. So what this will do is it'll just give me a space in between my count number and my next object. So I'm going to do another plus, and let's do statute description. Preview. Count 1, theft, comma, count 2, loitering, comma, and count 3, sassing to a law officer. So this is what a complex CCA looks like. The biggest thing is that you always specify the table before the comma. If you're doing free text, you do single quotes, and fill points need to be split with pluses even if it's just 2 fill points like this. Normally you won't see this because if I preview this, there won't be any space. It'll just be 1 theft, 2 loitering. So normally you'd have a second object in between these 2 fill points, and it would just be single quote, space, single quote, just like that. And this can go on and on. I could do statute code, class, penalty, all of this, and just have it simply CCA'd. Now a complex hard return is the exact same syntax, just HR instead of CCA. So there's my same thing, except it's in a hard return format. A few things to note with the CCA and the hard return when you're doing them in this style is Microsoft Word has this thing called smart quotes that make your little single quotes curly, and I really couldn't tell you why, but they will break your complex CCAs and hard returns. So you need to make sure in your Word settings that you have single quotes turned off if you're trying to do this. The next thing I'm going to talk about is subdocuments. So when I say subdocuments, I mean you insert a fill point and you point it at another document, and it's going to pull that other document into this one. A really good example of this is, say your agency has 100 court documents. They all use the same header. You probably want to have that one header inside a subdocument and then just call it into every one of those other subdocument, every other one of your templates. The reason for that being is, say your header has the name of your elected official and it's not a fill point, it's just hard text. Down the line, your elected official leaves, you get a new one. Instead of having to go to all 100 of your templates and change that, you now only have to go to that single subdocument and change it, and the change will take effect across the board. So I'll show you the syntax for a subdocument. You go under functions, and it's a component. It's the only component there is. Now when you're doing a subdocument, it has to already be saved into JDA in the database. So when I say that, I mean over here, it has to be in here somewhere. Now I'm not going to open any of these, but if you'll notice at the very top of your JDA document, JDA editor, sorry, it has the file path of whatever document you currently have open. The structure for this is always group / document name. In my example, I have unfiled as my group and webinar example as my document name. So this subdocument fill point right here would call this document, and I don't think you can call a document into itself. So, but I guess to stay consistent with my example, my group could be called headers, and this could be court header. And then that way I have my header in one place, calling it everywhere else, and then any modifications that need to happen to the header can just happen in one place instead of everywhere else. One thing to note with subdocuments is that sometimes the formatting from your subdocument can override the formatting from in your main document. So that's one thing to be aware of. If you start using subdocuments and you find you're having formatting issues, always check into your subdocuments as well, because there's a fair chance that might be where the formatting's coming from. A few final things I'd like to talk about are just some formatting tricks and tips for JDA. With a JDA fill point, the formatting of the fill point, like the text that ends on the preview or the generation, is solely determined by the % of the fill point. So if I make this entire fill point except the % red in preview, because my % is still black, the text will still be black. You may have back when you guys were first implemented, you might have noticed that your implementation teams highlighted their fill points to help you see exactly what was coming out of JustWare, and then help you from there see where. So they probably just have these fill points, these % highlighted. Another thing to note is when you're doing tables in JDA, JDA and tables tend to not get along very well. It's not very hard at all for you to corrupt your table and just break everything with a table and mixing JDA inside of it. So a few tips when you're doing tables in JDA is that if you're doing any kind of blocks, for each, if, or multi-select, any kind of those blocks at all, the two rules that I always follow is that they either begin and end inside the same cell, or they begin and it encompasses the entire table before it ends. Because if I, instead of encompassing the entire table, if I go here with my for each, it's going to, basically my JDA is going to explode. And I'm not sure why, it does not like it at all. See, I get some weird stuff going on, and then sometimes it corrupts your WinWord process and you have to completely close everything and reopen to get it back. So just 2 rules of thumb for tables is always begin and end inside the same cell, or encompass the entire table. For that, as far as encompassing the table goes, you can also have the beginning for each above the table, and it'll just loop the whole table over. One final thing to note on my advanced JDA webinar is that when you're doing multi-selects and for eaches throughout your document, you'll notice that, and I'm going to get a multi-select in here to show you. So when I do my multi-select against count, it works, as I would expect it to. But say somewhere outside my multi-select, I do an if statement against something on count. So we'll do, let's say I have it's a complaint document and the verbiage for my count 1 is different for every other count. So if JW count.countNum equals 1, count 1 verbiage here, else further count 2, and so on here. So what this is going to do is, since I have something hitting my JW count table outside of my multi-select, it's going to give me that second thing. So I'm going to uncheck 3 for this example. Now it's going to make me pick one or the other because it's outside of a loop. It doesn't know which row it needs to be pointed at. The best way around this, and sometimes this isn't always the best, sometimes this doesn't always solve your business need as far as running if statements against count stuff outside of your count multi-select, is there's one if clause that is exempt from popping dialog if it's outside your multi-select, and that is record count. So from my example earlier, you have the word count, and you have an if statement in here to vary whether there's an S on the end. Just like that. Record count will not pop dialog. So now in preview, no extra pop-ups. It works like I expect it to. There are certain SQL things that you can do in the data source if you absolutely need to check the values of something outside of a multi-select or a for each. A good example of this is like your count incident date. Say you have your statute text and everything down below, but then above you say the defendant did unlawfully commit, said crimes on this date. That sometimes doesn't always land inside the range of your multi-select. And then you're trying to call in count incident date above your multi-select, and it's going to ask you to pick which count you want. So there are certain things that we can do outside of just referring to record count for our if statements and stuff. And I'll cover that in the next section of our advanced JDA webinar when we're getting into data sources. To close, I'd like to thank you all again for your time. I will be doing the second part of this advanced JDA webinar, and we will be focusing on creating and manipulating data sources. I know that that's a pain point for a lot of people when it comes to JDA. They'll open up their edit data source and they just don't have what they need. They see all this code over here and they don't understand it. So we decided we're going to do a second portion and cover some tips and tricks on how to make this stuff do what you want it to do. So again, my name is Bryant Nelson. I appreciate your time, and if you have any questions or concerns, we will remain on the Join Me for the next 5 to 10 minutes or so while we finish up any questions that you might have.